December 21st, 1829. Snow is falling lightly outside, collecting ever so slowly on the frosted window of the one-story New Hampshire home of Daniel and Harmony Bridgman. Daniel holds Harmony, who is sweat-soaked and shaking with exertion. In Harmony's arms is a small bundle, Laura, the couple's third child. Laura had striking blue eyes and was significantly smaller than the couple's other two children, Mary and Frances. The first few months were happy. Soon, however, they began to notice that she fell ill quite often. Suddenly, within the first few months of life, Laura is shaking and spasming with what her parents would call fits, but is now known today as seizures. The fits became an almost daily occurrence. The seizures were so bad that her parents feared she wouldn't make it to her second birthday. Due to these fits and illnesses, she had fell behind developmentally. Things began looking up for Laura when she miraculously seemed to be catching up in September of 1832. She was gifted with a younger brother named Addison in November of that year. However, the family's seemingly good fortune with her would not last forever. In December, in the midst of an outbreak of scarlet fever, Daniel and Harmony's children were all struck ill. At just 2 years of age, Laura lay fitfully, screaming in pain as scarlet fever overtook her body. Tossing and turning, her throat was so swollen she could barely breathe. Somewhere in the midst of Laura's struggle, the illness cruelly snatches both of her older sister's young lives away. The inflammation from the illness rapidly spread to her eyes and ears, while the fever raged on. After a few agonizing weeks, her fever finally broke. Rendered deaf, blind, and unable to taste, or even sit up or walk, Laura faced a long road to recovery. The first thing her parents had noted once the fever had broken was that she developed photophobia, an extreme sensitivity to light. She'd cry out and hide under the covers any time light would hit her eyes. The sensitivity was so bad that she had to be moved to a dark room for 5 months straight. In order for them to move her out of the dark room, they put a blindfold over her eyes. Her photophobia never truly went away, therefore she wore the blindfold for the rest of her life. She was 3 when she finally regained her ability to walk without one of her caregivers or parents giving her assistance. Her recovery was not complete until she was 4 years old, when she was able to sit up unaided for long periods of time. This was 2 years after she initially contracted the scarlet fever that claimed her sisters' lives and almost claimed her as well. Laura almost immediately assimilated back into developing as a normal child would. It was almost as if she had not been on her deathbed at such a young age. She was just going to have to adapt in her own way to being both blind and deaf. She used home signs, often used by deaf children that have been isolated from ASL, to communicate with her parents. Touch became the forefront of her learning about the world, as she was unable to even taste food. Touch aided her in remaining in tune with her environment and even helped her learn how to assist in the daily chores on her parents' farm. Her mother taught her how to sew and knit at a young age in order to keep her inquisitive daughter occupied. Unfortunately, aside from that, the family didn't make too much of an effort to communicate back to her when she tried to tell them something in sign, whether it being them unable to figure out how to sign it back, or it be them not putting forth effort, or even them being too busy with their other 2 children. Whatever it might be, they made Laura feel isolated and lonely. At around age 7, she began to hang out with Azateni, a man who had limited speech. He taught her many signs, and the two would spend hours signing with one another. She particularly enjoyed the fact that he made an effort to communicate back to her instead of leaving her out of conversations. Despite this, like any other 7-year-old with a family that made her feel isolated, she became increasingly frustrated with the little effort her family would make to communicate. Her father was the only one who made even a little bit of effort, and that was by overpowering her when she was throwing tantrums. So, he was the only one she would obey. Her parents, unsure of what to do with their feisty daughter and wanting to raise the other children normal, signed her up for Perkins School for the Blind, where even the teachers were unsure of how to approach her. Enter Samuel Howe. Howe was born in 1801 and had grown up believing he was going to become a surgeon because his father wanted him to. And he did for a little bit, while serving as a field surgeon in Greece's fight for independence. However, after returning to Boston in 1831, he wanted to focus on the reform of society. So when offered a position in New England Asylum for the Blind, he took it, traveling to Europe to study blind education. Deaf-blind education was widely considered impossible at the time. Deafblind people were hardly even considered human, more seen as soulless husks. So, when Laura entered Perkins' school for the blind, Hal was the only one who would take her. Hal opted for teaching her English first because he wasn't particularly interested or a big believer in ASL. Hal would teach Lauren by giving her an object as well as a carved label so she could begin associating words with objects. She had managed to get an imitation in memory out of that, but not much else, so Hal mixed things up a little bit. He would cut up the labels he made and had her rearrange them so that they spelled a word. Now that she understood spelling and had some basic vocabulary, Hal began to teach her some sign language, which she had picked up easily. She found it much easier than using cut-out letters to work on spelling and grammar. Now she was able to interact with everyone she met. She was very friendly and always put on a smile. She was now able to make friends with other students at the school, and when not being social, she would practice finger-smelling, knitting, and sewing. Laura was infamous for her short temper. This was evident when she often grew annoyed with people that fingerspelled slowly. Now it was clear that she knew the basics of fingerspelling and Braille. Hal decided she needed to be put into an educational course. She was thrown into a curriculum where she learned to read, write, do math, history. Laura preferred to be in school and often didn't return home during holidays, opting to stay with her teachers. This might have been due to her parents' lack of interest in her. However, of course, her happiness would not last long. Hal, the man that she now considered a father figure, married Julia Ward, and went on his honeymoon in Europe for nearly a year and a half. Hal left specific instructions to leave her in the dark about social issues and religion, which her tutors would begrudgingly obey because they didn't want to face Hal's anger and disappointment. She returned home during the holidays of 1842 when she was 13 to meet her new baby sister, Mary. She was able to find immense comfort in her, and the two remained extremely close for the rest of her life. This was also around the time when she gained fame. She met Charles Dickens, who had come to visit the school, and was intrigued by the intelligent young girl. He ended up writing a section about her in his book, American Notes. After this, she became famous. Children wanted to be just like her. Long before I looked upon her, the help had come. Her face was radiant with intelligence and pleasure. Her hair, braided by her own hands, was bound about her head, whose intellectual capacity had developed, were beautifully expressed in its graceful outline and its broad open brow. Her dress, arranged by herself, was a pattern of neatness and simplicity. The work she had knitted lay beside her. Her writing book was on a desk that she leaned upon. From the mournful ruin of such bereavement, there was a slowly risen up this gentle, tender, guileless, grateful-hearted being. More importantly, though, Hal used this as an opportunity to boost his own ego. Hal wanted everyone to congratulate him on how excellent of a teacher he was to take on the case of a deaf-blind girl. So he began speaking out on how he was the reason she was able to do anything without assistance. This shifted the public's view from seeing her as a strong, independent woman to seeing her as the poor deaf-blind girl that can't do anything for herself. The public only wanted to focus on what she couldn't have done without Hal instead of what she was able to accomplish on her own. It was becoming more evident that Hal saw her more as an experiment than a person. Of course, no one ever told Laura that Hal was using her for profit. When Laura was at around the age of 14, Hal returned from his extended European honeymoon to continue teaching Laura. Hal really began to show his selfish side when he returned. When he returned, he was enraged to learn that Laura had been taught about religion by evangelists. His hopes of indoctrinating Laura into his religion had been crushed. Hal had hoped that by keeping her isolated from religion, she would willingly believe in whatever he told her to believe. He wanted her to remain dependent on him at all times, rather than finding things out for herself. Laura was never really told why Hal suddenly distanced himself from her after returning. That was an especially low blow for her, because she didn't know what she had done to push him away from her. A psychologist, Stanley G. Hall, came and observed her. He suggested that she had developed obsessive-compulsive disorder and was innately curious. Hal kept this on the down low because he wanted to keep up the facade that she would be dumb and lost without him. She fell into a deep depression at around the age of 20 because, once again, she was feeling isolated from other people. Hal sent her to live at home, figuring her family would bring out her happiness. This proved to be a dangerous and almost deadly move, because her family showed little interest in interacting with her aside from her sister Mary. This caused Laura to fall deeper and deeper into her depressed state. She stopped eating altogether at one point, raising alarm bells that being at home was not beneficial to her health at all. Howe decided that it would be better for Laura to be placed in a permanent home at Perkins School for the Blind, where she was given the opportunity to teach her favorite hobby, sewing. She was often regarded as a strict teacher that didn't take less than superior sewing work. Students often dreaded her class. However, she was a very effective teacher. In 1859, her depression was further fueled by the sudden death of her sister Mary, who was only 17 at the time. She turned to religion for comfort, because now her usual source of comfort was dead. She wanted to go to church, but it wasn't as inclusive as she would have liked. Determined, she taught fingerspelling to the pastor's wife, so she'd be able to enjoy the church service as well. Life would strike Laura yet another blow when Howe died in 1876. Though he didn't always have the right intentions, he was Laura's constant since she was almost 8. Many of her friends did not believe she would be able to survive through the summer. She spent most of her days unable to get out of bed due to all-consuming grief. Laura spent her last few years writing poetry about religion. I pass this dark home toward light home. Earthly home shall perish, but holy home shall endure forever. Earthly home is wintry. Hard it is for us to appreciate the radiance of holy home because of the blindness of our minds. How glorious holy home is, and still more than a beam of sun. Laura befriended Anne Sullivan, an almost blind woman with a rough childhood. Anne would later become famous for educating Helen Keller. Laura taught Anne fingerspelling, which would later be taught to Helen. In fact, just before her death in 1889, she sent a doll to Helen that she had sewn clothes for. Laura died at the age of 59 after battling an illness for weeks. Laura was able to show that deaf-blind people were in fact human. They weren't dumb, they weren't soulless, they experienced the pain of life, and they experienced the frustration, grief, loss, happiness, and fear. Laura is often forgotten by people despite her achievements and intellect. Howe is remembered because he used Laura's situation to boost his public image without her knowledge. Because, obviously, the teacher that taught the poor blind deaf girl is more important to the public than the girl that fought her whole life to even be seen as a human being by the public, and even by her own family. Laura Bridgman was an amazing person that propelled the movement to allow deaf-blind people to be educated. She should be remembered for her achievements, not for her teacher.